Until the 1860s, Italy was a partially rural society with many small towns and cities and almost no modern industry. In the north, in particular, people lived in the so-called casoni or black houses, whose overcrowded quarters were shared by humans and animals. And that was a society in which a cow's life and well-being were much more valuable than those of the family members. Indeed, poverty was the main reason for emigration, specifically the lack of land as property became subdivided over generations, the so-called frazionamento. And this is especially true for southern Italy, where the collapse of the feudal-like system in place before the unification had reduced the vast majority of the population to financial disarray. The two great Italian diasporas occurred in the 19th and the 20th centuries. The first wave of emigration began around 1880, 2 decades after the unification of Italy, and ended in the 1920s to the early 40s with the rise of fascism in Italy and the passing of laws aiming to prevent the loss of valuable manpower useful to Mussolini's autarkic plans. The second diaspora started after the end of World War II and roughly concluded in the 1970s. These two waves together constituted the largest voluntary emigration period in documented history. Between 1880 and 1980, about 15 million Italians left the country permanently, and most of them headed to Canada. The majority of the Italian immigrants traveled to Canada by ocean liner, landing at Pier 21 in Halifax, Nova Scotia, after the new Harbour Front Immigration Centre was opened in 1928. Before that date, migrants had to be processed through nearby American ports of entry. Many Italians heading to Canada after 1927 to find a better life boarded the Saturnia. Along with her sister liner, the Vulcania, the motor vessel was the first significant project by Italian engineer Niccolò Costanzi. On board, 240 passengers would be traveling in the luxurious first class, 270 in the second class, and 860 in the touristic class. It goes without saying that most immigrants would be considered as tourists and were unable to enjoy the marvelous halls and restaurants of the ship. Many others had to endure dreadful journeys on much cheaper vessels, and writer Edmondo De Amicis described them as ammonticchiati come giumenti, literally stacked one over the other like mares. On board of the Saturnia and other liners, the feelings of unfamiliarity associated with immigration often began during the voyage. For example, some Italian immigrants had brought food with them from home, such as cheeses and cured meats, only to have them confiscated immediately by immigration officials. Steamship operators provided passengers seeking work in Canada with a Guida dell'Emigrante, a handbook containing information on the new land, its laws, and some instructions on how to pronounce and use the most common words in English. This would help ensure their survival in the immediate aftermath of their arrival. Once immigrants landed in Canada and were processed by immigration officials, they boarded trains to take them to the final destinations, arriving at locations with unfamiliar climates and landscapes. Most immigrants transited through Union Station in Toronto, the largest of the great urban train stations built during the early 20th century, both in the country and in the whole of North America. Before the current structure, which was completed in 1927 and inaugurated by the Prince of Wales, an earlier Union Station was built in 1872 on Front Street between York and Simcoe Streets. The front of the old station, modeled on the Illinois Central Station in Chicago, was completed in 1895, had 3 domed towers one containing a clock, and its tall silhouette was a noted feature of the turn-of-the-century Toronto skyline. Once immigrants arrived in Canada, common prejudices held that Italians were prone to violence and that they introduced organized crime or fascism later on, seemingly undermining the moral fabric of the host society. Italian immigrants were also accused of taking jobs away from Canadians and living in overcrowded and unhealthy conditions, since they often lived in multiple family homes. Immigration also produced a series of severe fractures in immigrants' lives, families, and identities. The process of reconstruction of families separated by successive waves of immigration was often long and difficult. And this is the powerful image that Italian-Canadian poet Gianna Patriarca uses to describe her own experience. The year was 1960. My doll fell apart into the sea before reaching the shores of Halifax. I have long come to understand that that doll was the metaphor for my life. Its head and arms fell into the sea, finding their way back over the waves, while the torso and legs remained tight in my grip, and would head to Toronto on a slow train with my mother, my sister, and me to reconnect with the arms of a half-forgotten man.